Yes, well, I'm from Canada. Some of you can hear in my accent. And I grew up in Toronto, and then I did my studies at the University of Toronto and Montreal. I studied at McGill University for my master's and my PhD, a big university in Canada, and then I came to Australia in 2001. And I've been at the University of Queensland ever since, and been an Australian citizen since 2006. So I'm really settled there now. And I've always been interested in sort of injustice and how people make decisions that change the world, or they sometimes just keep going even though the world needs changing. So that's what I've studied in my career. Yes, so I have done a little bit of work on some other topics such as health decision making and identities and language, but my main focus has been on identities and group norms and decision making and conflict. And I've studied that in areas from environmental decisions and recycling or collective action to violent extremism and peace and decisions to create, to look for social justice with one form of action versus another. So basically I've studied a lot how people try to change the world and if anything works, Well, I actually started my studies in political science, and I thought that I would try and become a diplomat, and I wanted to create a more peaceful and socially just world. But I soon realized that's actually not what the diplomats want. So I realized, I have to try and understand where people get these ideas from. So in Canada at the time, diplomacy was sort of a way for people from privileged backgrounds to be part of these big international agendas, some of which are not very fair. So I started again, and I went to psychology because I thought it had a perfect blend of evidence and curiosity and justice. So in some fields that I was interested in, like anthropology, I studied anthropology. There wasn't always the same focus on evidence. I loved experiments. And then in some other fields, there wasn't enough of a focus on justice for me. So I love social psychology, which allows you to look at things that you're curious about, that create a better world, and that are very, very interesting. Yeah. So group norms are social rules or standards for behavior. So they're things that are normally invisible to us, but they profoundly change our decisions. So one example is that normally it's a norm that one person finishes before the next person starts. And so without even realizing, maybe, you're waiting until I pause before you say something again, and after I stop, you'll speak. And that kind of thing is really important. Norms influence us for the way that we engage in polite behavior, but also the way we engage in all behavior. So is it normal for a woman to go to undergrad and do studies at the university? How many children will she have? When will she get married? These things change over history and in different cultures. And the way that that influences your decision and my decision is through the group norms that we have. So growing up in the 1990s, I was allowed to go to university, but 100 years before, women could not do that. And those rules are not something that you even think about sometimes. You don't realize the ways in which you're limited or empowered by your society. So that's a short answer. Yes, they're very impactful in the kind of work that I do. So I think they're impactful in all decisions, but sometimes a researcher might be interested in only looking at the variability within a context. An example would be, how much do people, let's say cheat using ChatGPT in their assignments. And that person might be looking at factors like your self-efficacy, your confidence, or your attitudes. And the reason why those are important is because it predicts variability within a context. But whenever you're interested in looking across different contexts, you can see, wow, people in this discipline cheat a lot more than others. So in psychology, in studies, we cheat less than, for example, economics in Western studies. I don't know if it's the same at UI, So most psychology comes from a moral basis, and those between group differences are all about norms. So I'm really interested in those kinds of differences. And I think it's also important because when we try to eliminate a social problem, we often need to change the norms. So we need to make a context where students, let's say, that have been disrespectful learn to treat each other with respect. That's a norm change. So it's an important variable, I think. Yes, that's right. Well, I have not done much literature in Indonesia, so I'll start by saying that. But the kinds of factors that have come up in my research in Australia is that it's actually very important to think about different audiences and time frames and goals that you might have. So one first step that you might have is to raise awareness of a cause, raise awareness of a problem. But after that, you might want to develop sympathy for your goal, because sometimes we can be aware of a cause but not personally feel sympathy. And then if you have sympathy, it's very common for people not to act. We want to generate intentions to take action and then action. So if we think about cheating, we don't want just people to know that it's a problem or feel like people shouldn't cheat. We want them not to cheat in their intentions and their action. And when we look at the social world broadly and we look at campaigns, for example, it might be to reduce the waiting time in hospitals. That might be something that you'll be campaigning for, so that people could come into a hospital and they would be seen more quickly. We talk about 3 additional goals, and those are, firstly, to be ready to fight for a long time, right? Because it's very common for people to get depressed and lose their commitment and heart. But a lot of changes take years, and some even take decades. You have to be able to sustain your motivation in that time. And then the other 2 factors that we've looked at is building a broader coalition, bringing other people together to achieve the change that you need. Like it might be doctors and politicians, and maybe even like funders are going to be needed to make this change. And then avoiding and managing opposition. So, in the case of hospitals, I'm sure nobody really wants to have an increase in waiting time. Most people support reducing the waiting time. But using money towards that goal might mean that other people can't do what they want. So we need to address all of these goals. That's one issue. And we need to think about the short term, the medium term, and the long term. So when we want to create social change as organizers or as students, we have to think, where are we now? Do people know about what's going on, but they're not taking action? Or maybe they are taking action, but it isn't working and they're feeling depressed. So each of these is a different situation that we can then look at and try and pick actions that will be helpful in that situation. Yes, well, what we found in our lab is there's, let's say, 3 things that are very important. The first is, maybe you're not always the right person to speak. And so we have to think of creating a chain of trust to the other people. So for example, let's say you're only a student and people don't take students as seriously, but you could go and you could speak to a religious leader, and if that person was able to speak on your behalf, then the mayor would listen. So you try to create a chain of trust to the decision maker, and sometimes that means asking someone else to pass the message along instead of trying to always be the one to speak yourself. The second factor is to try and be respectful and to imagine that the other person is a real person who's listening to you. It's very, very common for protesters to be angry and frustrated and feel like they are fighting against people who are evil. But as you can imagine, there's very little research in psychology to show that if you make someone feel like you think that they're evil, they listen to you better, right? If you stigmatize someone and if you express anger and contempt, they will get angry and contemptuous at you and they will not listen. So it's helpful to think of the other person as a real person and speak to them with respect the way you would want to be spoken to. And then another factor that's really important is thinking about kind of power, and that's why we talk about this idea of bringing people together. Sometimes there's a real social justice issue, but nobody really cares about it who has power. So you've convinced everyone around here, but they don't have the power to make that change. So we need to then think about how can we create a chain of trust, not just between people, but between groups? So this neighborhood needs to get all the way to the mayor's office. Maybe is it religious leaders that could help? Could it be a sports person that could help? Is there perhaps a professional society, like some of the lawyers here know the lawyers there that could connect? So it's really thinking very strategically about that, and thinking about how you can build a coalition that has the power to take the decision that you want. Yeah, it can be positive and negative. So it's positive because it makes it so much easier to raise awareness. Very, very easy to retweet and to see something spread around the world in a viral way. But it's negative because the kinds of people that you speak to on social media are often the people who already agree with you. And studies have shown that on social media, people express more negative emotions than they do in real life. And they also are more likely to kind of retweet and click on posts that have negativity in them. And so the problem with that is those kinds of posts, even though they're powerful for supporters to communicate with each other and share, they don't really convince people that don't agree with you. They more create a bad energy. And so they might be good to raise awareness of injustice and to build a community that cares about that. But in order to convince other people, you have to go beyond social media oftentimes and beyond negativity. So they're a tool, but they can be a tool with two edges, right? A double-edged sword. They can make social change harder, and they can make it easy for hostile and oppositional behavior to spread. And that's not always positive for social change. Yeah. I think it really comes in part to thinking about the short-term, medium-term, and longer-term goals. So many campaigns use misinformation or disinformation. And then what you're doing in the long term is you're exploiting a relationship where people trust you to say something that's not true, to manipulate them to create change. But that, over the long term, is really bad for society. So we have to think, in order to create long-term a socially just world, we need to create chains of trust based on integrity, where you don't say what's not true, and based on respect, so you're not trying to manipulate other people, but you are trying to convince them and persuade them. And that is much slower and of course harder. But I think a psychologist would say that fast change by manipulating people often doesn't last. So it depends what you're trying to campaign about. But for example, if we're trying to change the policies of the university, we need to think about the fact that even in 5 years after you've graduated, these academics will still be here, or these bureaucrats will still be here. So we really want to convince them that what the policy change is needed and is the right thing to do. We need to look at, do they have sympathy for us? Do they agree with us? So that they're not just changing because they're aware that we want them to change, but they'll change back as soon as you graduate. We want to make sure that we have a scenario where you've told them about a problem and a solution and they agree with you. This is the right thing to do. And then even when you're gone, they respect what you said and they're acting the way you wanted. Yes, I think that's where it's so important to think about your opponents as one audience. So it's really, really common, especially in politics, to have a very negative message about your opponents. And that, of course, sometimes is something that makes people give donations or go to a rally because they're angry. But at the same time as your side is getting angry and acting, the other side is also getting angry and acting. So to avoid a backlash, we need to avoid at least 3 mistakes. The first is not thinking of the other people and the mistrust that they have, because their lack of trust has created this problem, and if we make it worse, it's going to make problems in the future. And the second is sometimes people, when they're trying to engage a problem, they will overstate that problem. And so, for example, they might say, I'm very concerned about opium and opioid addiction, which is killing so many people in, let's say, the United States or Canada. Well, the reality is, it is killing many thousands of people. It is a serious problem. But most communities don't support that. Most people don't want that. Parents don't want it. Kids don't want it. Nobody wants tens of thousands of people to die of opioid addiction. So can we start from the positive instead of the negative? The disadvantage of that is that it can be slower to get people's attention. But the positive of that is that it gathers together a stronger community of actors. And instead of presenting people in a negative, stigmatizing way that makes them angry, it can create a relationship where the campaign can really work. And then the last thing that's just really important is to really speak inclusively. We should be very careful whenever we hear ourselves using words like they and them. They are the problem, they need to change. We are the problem, we need to change, So we should always be thinking about inclusive language where we are part of the social context. We also need to change. We also are part of the problem, and they are also part of our solution. And that will make a more lasting change. It's very common, especially at first, for people to just come in and say, we're doing the right thing, they're doing the wrong thing. But as we know as psychologists, there's little evidence that that's a great way to create behavior change. Whether you're a parent or a child or a wife and a husband, if you start by saying, I'm right, you're wrong, you've started from the wrong place. So we need to start from a different place where we talk about our relationship, our city, our country, and how we both love it and we want things to go well. That's a good starting place. Yeah, I think I like inequality as a major focus because inequality is relevant to everything. Men and women, different cities and regions of Indonesia, different religions and ethnic groups, people with disabilities. When we focus on inequality, we focus on everything. And so how can we create equality? By focusing first on equality of opportunity, things like healthcare, education, even simple things like, can someone go to high school? Can they go to university? If they are able to have these real life-changing opportunities, then they will be acting for the rest of their lives from a place of more empowerment and more learning and more understanding and more confidence and more wealth. So equality is a great thing to approach, and whichever context you approach it in, I think it's good to realize everything is interconnected. So not everyone has enough time to do everything in the world. You might be focusing on poverty and hunger in your local community, or you might be focusing on gender-based violence and protecting women from assault, or you might be focused on issues of justice and corruption and fighting against that. But I think when we take an inequality lens, then we understand what we want to do is not take away the power of advantaged groups. We want to lift up people who are disadvantaged and give them opportunities, give them power. We want to give them opportunities of knowledge, opportunities of action. I think an inequality lens is a great way of going forward. So things like the hospital context that we just talked about, if people have to wait all day in a hospital before they can be treated, then they're not working, they're not with their family. So when we reduce wait lists, we're helping that person to be with their family, to work. It affects wealth, it affects family relations. Or when we give people the opportunity, maybe there's no university in this region and we build one, hundreds of people will benefit every year forever maybe. And so really thinking about how we can start to put in place new policies, new systems, new practices, new ways of thinking and being and doing that give more inclusive opportunities to more people. Yes, well, you're very lucky to be at UI. I would say elsewhere in Indonesia, it matters a lot what university you go to. So if you're at another undergraduate university, you really want to look and see in Indonesia who the famous scholars are in your area, and if possible, try and study with them, because it's like what we just talked about, you just learn so much, right? You're stepping up a huge gap. If you're already fortunate to be at a place like UWI, which is so well resourced, I would say maybe just realize how much this time is very precious and learn as much as you can in this very short time. It seems like a long time, 3 years, but it goes by so quickly. And when you have the pressure of work and family, you won't have those opportunities. So I would say as much time as you can, learn as much as you can, and try to take advantage of the internet. It's wonderful you guys are doing this podcast, right? And so through here, people all over the country can listen to you, and you can listen to people all over the country and internationally. So there's many podcasts in social psychology. There's many talks that are available to attend. Sometimes you can just Google them, or you might be following, like people can sign up to my lab. We have an email list. You can just apply and click, and we will let you know every time we give a talk, and then you can watch it. And not just me, classes, maybe there's academics at Harvard or academics at MIT. Why would you not listen to a person if you're very interested in their research? Go to their website, and if it turns out that they have an open lab with an open seminar series, maybe 1 week after you're interested in a researcher, you're seeing them present or their students present. So take advantage of the internet that brings us all so close together.
Lead and innovate.